Shop now on KarmaloopTV and get free shipping on any order. Just use the promo code Chelsea.
As of this recording, President Obama is meant to announce tonight at West Point Military Academy that the U.S. will be sending an additional 30,000 troops to Afghanistan to continue doing battle with the resurgent Taliban and whatever pockets of al-Qaeda are still there. Though I think a lot of the al-Qaeda types are now in Pakistan, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, the interesting or sadly ironic thing about all of this is that our enemies, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, were strengthened and nurtured by U.S. support back in the day. They were effing with the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan, and you know, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, so even though we always kind of hated each other, they were useful to us at the time. But now we have to kill them. So you know that the Mujahideen fighters morphed into the Taliban and al-Qaeda, but did you know that one of these wonderful people turned out to be none other than Osama bin Laden? Did you know that U.S. involvement in Afghanistan dates all the way back to 1979? Yep, before you were born. If you didn't know these things, or are just curious to learn a little bit, I suggest you watch the rest of this clip because we're probably going to be there for a while, at least until 2011. First of all, allow us to locate Afghanistan for you. It's not in the Middle East, it's in Southwest or South Central Asia, depending on your definition. Though I've never been, it's meant to be a land of majestic, if harsh, beauty. A lot of people think that the population of Afghanistan is Arab. Well, it's not. Though there are Arabs in Afghanistan, they're not indigenous. The makeup of the population is for the most part Pashtun, that's the biggest group, Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara. The population speaks mainly Pashto, Persian, and its relative Dari. Islam is the official religion, predominantly Sunni versus Shiite, but if you're into Zoroastrianism, you can find that too.
Let's burn something.
After being part of various empires, including the Indian Mughal and the Persian, Afghanistan had a more or less stable monarchy from the 1930s until the 1970s when a Marxist government seized power. What happened after that went more or less like this. Many Afghans, coming from a rural, non-technological religious society, didn't care for the secular and modern reforms being imposed on them by the Marxists, including land reform and equal rights for women, going so far as implementing literacy programs. And they rebelled. The Soviets invaded to keep the commie dream alive, which only further inflamed the Afghans because nobody likes an invader. Soviet tanks rolled in on Christmas morning 1979. Not really meaningful in that part of the world, or for the Soviets, but kind of had a certain tragic, poetic je ne sais quoi to some Western observers.
Just 1,000 miles to the east of Iran, heavy fighting continues in Afghanistan. Muslim rebel leaders claim some victories over invading Soviet troops in parts of the country, with a great number of Russian soldiers killed. Western sources were unable to confirm any of those reports.
By this point, the United States had already committed to helping the rebels. Starting on July 3, 1979, when President Jimmy Carter authorized the CIA to spend $500,000 on propaganda and psyops and to provide small non-military equipment and good old cashola to the rebels. Through the 80s, the Mujahideen, these religious rebel fighters comprised of local Afghans, Afghans from refugee camps, or Arab volunteers, were funded and supplied by the US, the UK, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Actually, technically Pakistan was just the channel through which they were supplied, not the actual supplier, because they've got no money. Aid was channeled through Pakistan, specifically through its shady Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, because Pakistan demanded that, and the US was happy to go along as it didn't have a presence on the ground in Afghanistan and was also operating in a post-Vietnam environment, so there was definitely no mood in Congress to become engaged anywhere. Because of America's hands-off approach, the groups who received assistance and the proportion of assistance that they received were determined by the ISI. And let's just say that they weren't really feeling the secular or more reasonable anti-Soviet fighters, instead preferring the really, really, really hardcore Islamists. So yes, you heard right. Basically, we funded and supplied military equipment, including Lee Enfield rifles and between 2,000 and 2,500 Stinger missiles to crazy religious nuts. But they did push out the Soviets, which was important to us at the time. Why was this so important? Well, you might have heard of this little thing called the Cold War, and we were sort of entangled with the Soviets and didn't want them to have influence anywhere. Their influence was kind of sucky, plus if they could have influence anywhere, that made us look bad, like losers. But at first we didn't even think that our assistance was going to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan completely. We wanted to increase their transaction costs, so to speak, tie them down and embarrass them, if we could, much like they did with us in Vietnam. But with US assistance, the rebels proved to be more than just pesky. And 1986 was a watershed year because that's when the US started supplying Stingers, and the Mujahideen were then able to start taking down Soviet aircraft. Finally, the Soviets left in 1989, with the last soldier crossing the border on foot. And the US totally lost interest in Afghanistan. Mohammad Najibullah, I love that name, the Afghan communist leader, stayed in power until 1999 when the Soviet Union fell apart, because they may have withdrawn, but they were still sending him money. And Afghanistan continued to be battered by civil war and then governed, if you can call it that, by various and competing warlords who robbed, stole, and devastated the country's infrastructure more than they actually governed. In 1994, partially in response to this mayhem on the ground, an ultra-conservative group calling itself the Taliban emerged. Sort of like Robin Hood protecting the population from the predations of the Sheriff of Nottingham, but not nice or gallant like good old Robin of Locksley. Thanks to their drive to succeed, and a lot of funding from former Mujahideen fellows in arms, the Taliban, with the one-eyed former anti-Soviet fighter Mullah Muhammad Omar as their political and spiritual leader, started to really get the country under their thumb, with a uniquely medieval and harsh rule. Stoning anyone? By 1996, the Taliban had taken over the capital city of Kabul and gained effective control of Afghanistan. And by 2001, they pretty much had the whole country in their clutches, except for a small corner in the north, which was the anti-Taliban base of operations of the last holdout and super brave and resilient fighter Ahmad Shah Massoud, known as the Lion of Panjshir or the Lion of the North. Massoud was an amazing strategist and was instrumental in kicking out the Soviets, and was at that time our last best hope for kicking out the Taliban. Sadly, on September 9, 2001, after all the failed attempts to bring him down in battle, Massoud was felled by 2 suicide bombers posing as journalists. Assholes. Some highlights of Taliban's enlightened rule included banning women from public life, which also meant going to school, the destruction of non-Islamic art relics, beardless faces on men, a serious no-no, no radio, music, or dancing, basically no fun allowed ever. Oh, and they also allowed Afghanistan to become a haven for Islamic militants from all over the world, a real nest of hoo-haws and dirtbags. After the events of 9/11, the Taliban refused US requests to extradite Osama bin Laden, who had been holding up there since '96, and this led to the US and British military action that's still in effect to this day. Because, though we had them running at one point, and things seemed to be progressing, new president, international support, we got distracted, way late even in Iraq. Thanks for that, baby Bush Duvalier. And our lack of attention, again, allowed the bearded boys from the Dark Ages to reassert control and give us a real run for our money, which they're still doing today. I'm turning into Jose, only less attractive.